Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Pam, good afternoon. Come to order, please. Now is the time to turn off your cell phones as a courtesy to our guest. This Thursday, we'll have our farewell to Doc at 5:30 p.m. That's April 30, Thursday. There will be music here from the Wheeling Symphony. There will be really good food from Midge's Kitchen, all free, and we will remember the good Dr. Yassini. Please let me know if you'll be attending because we just need a head count for various things. And it's at 5:30. Goes till about 7 o'clock. That's p.m. If you come at a.m., you can do jumping jacks outside. Okay. Next Tuesday, Julia Flint. We were promised how an Appalachian grandmother fought a corporate giant. The problem with that one is the construction out. They're closing our parking lot. The big one. But I am not going to cancel this program because she's coming from a long way. So I'm giving you fair warning. There's a small lot on the side. There may be spaces open on the street. I don't know. I don't know if the city will let us park in their lot, Mr. Mayor. Park at your own risk. But I hope you all can make it because it should be a good one. As is today. We have with us from Pittsburgh, Zachary Brodt. He's the University Archivist and Records Manager for the University of Pittsburgh Library System. And he's the author of a book called From the Steel City to the White City, Western Pennsylvania and the World's Columbian Exposition, which you will hear about today. He was the 2016 recipient of the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference's Arlen Custer Memorial Award for Best Article for Strikeout, A Pirate's Picture, and the Battle of Homestead. I read this article. It's very good. It's available online. I recommend it. I didn't know there was a Pittsburgh pirate picture at Homestead, but very interesting. He's currently completing a biography of Mary Croghan Shenley, Pittsburgh heiress, whose elopement started a transatlantic scandal, and philanthropy became synonymous with the city's Oakland neighborhood. Please welcome Zach Brodt.
Well, thank you, Sean. I thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm going to apologize. It's allergy season, and it kind of hit me in full force this week, so I apologize for my voice. But thank you all for coming. I'm going to share some of my research and stories from my book today. So we're going to start by taking a look at how Western Pennsylvania influenced the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago through planning and exhibits. Talk a little bit about how Pittsburghers experienced the fair as tourists. And then we're going to kind of flip the script, and we're going to take a look at how the exposition actually influenced Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania at the turn of the century. So before we kind of dive in, just kind of a quick background on World's Fairs. So these were the premier tourist attractions in the Victorian period. They were essentially meant to kind of foster international trade with the host country. And thanks to advances in ocean and rail travel, these truly became global events. So the first World's Fair was in 1851 in London. This was the idea of Prince Albert to try to get the world to come to London, see everything that was being produced in England, and kind of foster some trade with Great Britain. The first American Fair is in 1876 in Philadelphia, the Centennial Exposition. This was initially meant to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, but then it also kind of quickly turned into a way for the United States to show the world that the country had recovered from the Civil War, that Reconstruction was over, and that the U.S. was a viable trade partner again. And then in 1889, Paris hosts the Exposition Universelle, and this becomes sort of the benchmark against which all the other World's Fairs are measured. We all know this one because this is where the Eiffel Tower debuts. And when Americans went to the Paris Fair, they saw how France was sort of representing itself as this industrial powerhouse. They saw these large groups of people, and they thought, it's time to invite the world back to the United States. A lot has changed since 1876, and we need to show the world everything that is transpiring here in the U.S. And so they look to the 400th anniversary of Columbus's first voyage to the New World as sort of being a great excuse to invite everybody to North America. And they quickly sort of, though, identified a problem, because when they were at the Paris Fair, they realized that it takes a lot of really skilled artists and architects to put on a World's Fair. And luckily for the Paris Fair, there's a school called the École des Beaux-Arts in France that turns out exactly that. It trains artists and architects to work on really large-scale projects. But the problem was the United States didn't have a school like that. They were actually sending people to France to study at the École. And so Congress looked to Chicago as kind of being a way to overcome this obstacle. Chicago was just finishing up rebuilding after the Great Fire in 1871, and so the city had sort of a small body of really skilled architects who were accustomed to managing several large projects all at the same time. And so they hired Daniel Burnham of Chicago to sort of lead the effort to build the Columbian Exposition. He pulls together an all-star team of American architects, and they meet in Chicago, and they quickly realize that the style, the neoclassical style that's being taught in France, is actually perfect for World's Fair. And that's what they settle on for here in Chicago. It's sort of already proven itself to be a good style for large exhibit halls. It also means that when those architects go home and they start doing all their drawings and they send them back to Chicago to actually build the buildings, it's a vernacular that everybody understands. So they can easily sort of translate those blueprints directly into the buildings themselves. Those architects also decided that all of the buildings would have the same cornice height. So you see like there's a line sort of symmetry where all those buildings appear from the ground to be about the same height. Later on, they also decided to paint all the buildings mostly white, and so this is where we get the term White City from. Now, another benefit of having the fair in Chicago was its location. So Chicago is essentially in the middle of the country at the time, and they knew that most of the visitors would be traveling from either the American Northeast or from Europe. And so that meant that most of the visitors coming to the fair would actually have to spend about a day on a train to get to Chicago. And so it sort of puts the entire country on display as part of the fair before they even get to the city and the fairgrounds. Pittsburghers are excited about this because a lot of those trains traveling from the Northeast are actually going to pass through town. And so that means that folks who are already familiar with things that are happening in Pittsburgh, like the steel industry, they might want to stop by, and maybe they'll be interested, maybe they'll do a tour of a factory, maybe they'll even invest in some of the companies in Pittsburgh. And surely, if they're not already familiar with what happens in Pittsburgh, once they go to Chicago and they see all these great exhibits, they're going to want to make a stop there on their way home. Now, Pittsburgh has sort of been preparing for the World's Fair for a while, and they didn't even realize it, going back to the Civil War. So in 1864, they host something called a sanitary fair, which was essentially a big fundraiser to raise money for the Union Army. And the sanitary fair was sort of this combination of their traditional sort of agriculturally based county fair, but then also an industrial fair like World's Fairs, where they're showing some industrial products being produced in the city. Pittsburghers loved it. They turned out in droves. Pittsburgh actually donated more money per capita than any other city that hosted a sanitary fair during the war. And so they realized they sort of hit on something. And so in 1875, Pittsburgh hosts its first industrial fair, making it one of the first cities in the country to do so. What we get then next is over the next almost 20 years of Pittsburgh hosting its own fairs locally, but then we also have a lot of companies who are putting on exhibits at other fairs across the country and other World's Fairs as well. This is the same time that industry in Pittsburgh is really on the uptick. And so we suddenly have a lot of companies and industrialists who not only are invested in the success of their exhibits, but they also have a ton of money to pour into it to make sure that these are successful. And of course, when we think about wealthy industrialists in Pittsburgh in the 1890s, the first name to come to mind is Andrew Carnegie. And Carnegie is involved in sort of one of the big early news stories relating to the Chicago World's Fair. Planners for the fair realized that the Paris Fair in 1889 was so successful because of their big attraction, the Eiffel Tower. People came just to see that. And so they realized that the Chicago Fair was going to need something similar, or hopefully better than the Eiffel Tower, to get people to come to the fair. So if you're going to try to do something better than the Eiffel Tower, what's the most logical next step? You're going to build a taller tower, right? And so over the next few months, Daniel Burnham and the World's Fair Committee start to entertain a lot of ideas for a tall tower for the Chicago Fair. The most viable one was the one that we see here, the American Tower, and it was designed by an engineer named George Morrison, who typically designed railroad bridges. This tower would stand 1,180 feet tall, and it had 3 platforms, so people could pay a certain amount to go to each platform so they could take in the sights of the fair, the city of Chicago, the lake, and on and on. Now, you need a lot of steel to build a tower this size, and if you need that much steel in 1891, you're going to come to Pittsburgh and you're going to talk to one of Andrew Carnegie's companies. And so Morrison and his company reached out to Keystone Bridge and asked them if they would be willing to supply the steel for the tower and also the expertise to actually build it. They met with Henry Clay Frick and some of the other boards at Keystone, and Keystone Bridge agreed to build the tower. Now, as you can imagine, a lot of the newspapers across the country are interested in any news at all that's coming out about the World's Fair, especially something about the premier attraction. And so when they get word that one of Carnegie's companies is tied to this tower project, they start to print all these articles about this huge tower that's going to be built in Chicago. But the problem is they refer to it as Carnegie's Tower or Carnegie's project. And when Andrew Carnegie heard that and saw that in the newspaper, he was livid. Carnegie, for one thing, did not think that this was going to be a viable business venture. He thought people were going to see through it as a money-making scheme and that they wouldn't pay the money to go up to the top of the tower. He also thought that the company intentionally leaked his name to the press as a way to sort of add some credibility to the project, to get people to invest, to actually pay to build the thing. And so Carnegie puts Frick in an awkward position and asks Henry Clay Frick to back the company out of the deal that they made to build the tower. So Frick writes to Morrison and explains that the use of Carnegie's name was unacceptable and that they could no longer be participating in this project. Morrison writes back and says that's fine, but then the world's going to know that a contract worth Carnegie really isn't worth a damn, and sort of threatens to ruin Carnegie's business. In the meantime, the tower company is sort of reorganizing, and their new president reaches directly out to Andrew Carnegie and basically says, you know, the folks that were in charge before, they did a good job of reaching out to people and getting promises for investments, but we didn't actually collect a lot of cash. And so if you can supply some money and invest in the tower project, we have others here that promise they'll invest the same amount and we can build this and everybody will be wealthy and happy. It was exactly like Carnegie predicted. They wanted his money, or they wanted his name tied to the project so it would be successful. And Carnegie finally steps in personally and says, we are not participating and this tower is never actually built. So it's now January of 1891. And the fair is scheduled to open, January of 1892, and the fair is scheduled to open in May of 1893, and Burnham still doesn't have his big attraction. And so at a meeting of engineers that meets regularly to talk about issues surrounding the fair, he sort of vents a little bit, we'll say, and says it's really embarrassing that United States engineers have not been able to come up with a new attraction for the Columbian Exposition. And says that it's not just enough to build something that's big, it has to be something unique. And fortunately for Burnham, one of the engineers in the room that day is from Pittsburgh, and his name is George Washington Gale Ferris. And shortly after the meeting, he sketches out the designs for what becomes known as the first Ferris wheel. So Ferris meets with the fair commissioners in, I think it's March 1892, and presents his wheel idea. And they say, thanks, but no thanks. They just spent months watching the steel skeleton of their buildings in the Court of Honor get toppled over from the winds coming off of the lake. And they thought that something this tall and this sort of flimsy looking was not going to survive. And they could not invite disaster to the fair. So they told Ferris he could not build his wheel. Ferris returns to Pittsburgh, pours thousands of dollars into new drawings of the wheel design. He hires another engineer who has to invent the math to determine the stresses and the weight that would be placed on the axle of the wheel as it's turning. And he brings all of these new drawings and all this new data back to Chicago around June. And this time the fair commissioners say, yes, you can build your wheel. And then the next day they say, you know what, on second thought, no, you can't build the wheel. And this time, the fear wasn't so much about the structure itself. It was about perception. They thought that the presence of a wheel like this was undignified, and it would take away from the seriousness of the exhibits that were in the great white buildings in the Court of Honor. But Ferris, to his credit, realized that they were running out of time to build something for the fair. And so he comes back to Pittsburgh and he founds a company whose sole purpose would be to build a wheel at the fair, operate it during the duration of the fair, and then tear it down at the conclusion. And now it's December of 1892, and he returns to Chicago for a third time to present his wheel idea. And still reluctantly, they finally agree to let Ferris build his Ferris wheel. Now, to get this built in a timely manner and not lose too much time from when the fair opens at the beginning of May, Ferris has to start construction immediately. The problem with that, it's the middle of winter in Chicago. The ground is frozen solid, and so they actually have to use dynamite to loosen the earth so they can pour the foundations. Ferris comes back to Pittsburgh, and he uses his connections throughout the steel industry, both in Pennsylvania and Ohio, to basically contract out the individual pieces of the wheel to different companies, because he knows that there's no way that one steel company can produce everything he needs in a timely manner. And he stations inspectors at those mills to inspect every piece as it's coming off the line, because it all has to get shipped to Chicago and put together like a giant puzzle, and it has to be right the first time. Because the longer that the fair's open without the wheel, that means the more money that the fair and Ferris are going to be losing at the end of the day. So in mid-June of 1893, the wheel finally opens at the fair, so it's about a month and a half into the fair. Upon its completion, it stands about 280 feet tall. There are 36 cars, each about the size of a trolley. At its capacity, the wheel holds 1,440 people at one time, who each pay 50 cents for a 20-minute, 2-revolution ride around the wheel. So 50 cents is the same amount of money that it costs just to get into the Columbian Exposition. But ultimately, though, by the end of the fair, they sell 1.5 million tickets for rides on the Ferris wheel. That's compared to 1.9 million tickets sold to get up to the top of the Eiffel Tower. So even though they lost a month and a half, they still got pretty close to the Eiffel Tower. And truly, the wheel was a success. It's credited with sort of saving the Columbian Exposition because attendance numbers were very low at the start of the fair. Ferris and the wheel both sort of become celebrities throughout 1893. There's lots of souvenirs with their pictures on it. They appear on sheet music and fiction books, all kinds of things. But Ferris is essentially credited with saving the Columbian Exposition early on and bringing people to Chicago. Now, another promise, in addition to building something better than the Eiffel Tower, that the fair planners made was that the Columbian Exposition was going to be the largest display of electric light the world had ever seen up to that time. But they made that promise right at the height of the War of the Currents between Thomas Edison and his direct current electricity, and George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla and their alternating current electricity. Those two sides have been engaged in a public relations battle for a few years. It got so vicious that at one point, Thomas Edison actually invented the electric chair using Westinghouse parts and alternating current electricity. to prove how dangerous and how careless Westinghouse was being. He actually wanted to call being killed by the electric chair getting Westinghoused. Like, that's how bad it got. But campaigns like that take a lot of money. And so when a recession hit, both Edison and Westinghouse were at risk of losing control of their companies. Westinghouse was able to maintain control of his, but Edison actually loses control of his electric companies in a merger that forms General Electric. So in April of 1892, when the Columbian Exposition solicits bids to electrify the fair, General Electric and Westinghouse are really the only two companies in the country that have the capacity to be able to do what they're asking them to do. General Electric submits a bid for an all-direct current system to light the fair. Westinghouse submits an all-alternating current bid that's $1 million cheaper. Now, we might think, of course, the fair that's already sort of cash-strapped is going to pick the Westinghouse bid because it's so much cheaper. But there's a few things working against Westinghouse at this time. For one thing, some of the people that are responsible for making the decision actually have an interest in General Electric. So they stood to make money by picking General Electric as the provider. GE also holds all of Edison's patents for electrical machinery, for the light bulb, that was currently in use. And so even if Westinghouse got the bid, there was no guarantee that he could actually get everything in place without infringing upon Edison and therefore GE's patents. But regardless, the allure of saving $1 million was just too much to pass up. And so Burnham and his team decide to extend the contract to Westinghouse, but George Westinghouse had to post a bond of $1 million that promised that come May 1st, when it was time to open the fair, everything that he installed in the fairgrounds would work. So essentially, his company is on the line as to whether or not he is successful at lighting the fair. Westinghouse returns to Pittsburgh. He immediately sets his engineers to work at designing the largest dynamos in the world, and I think they make either 6 or 8 of them. He then has to invent a new type of light bulb that does not infringe on Edison's patents, and he has to invent a machine that can make them quickly, and tens of thousands of them, in less than a year's time so that they can be produced, shipped, and installed in Chicago. But come May 1st, when President Cleveland is standing in front of hundreds of thousands of people on the opening day, and he pushes a gold telegraph key on that stage, everything springs to life. Westinghouse was successful at lighting the fair. So how did he do it? How was he able to submit a bid that was $1 million cheaper than General Electric? Westinghouse essentially approached the World's Fair as like a big advertisement. So he built the entire system at cost, because he knew that if he could be successful in Chicago, it would lead to other lucrative contracts down the road. And he was right, because shortly after the Columbian Exposition, Westinghouse gets the contract to harness the hydroelectricity at Niagara Falls, and basically changes the face of electricity in the United States and really North America. Westinghouse saw this as an advertisement, so he actually put the large marble control panel for the entire system on display, and it was all controlled by one person. So people visiting the fair could go and see how safe alternating current really was. So this was much more effective than the electric chair idea that Edison had. So once Westinghouse was able to get all of his system in order to light the fair, then he sort of switched gears and looked to the actual company exhibit that would be on display in the electrical building, which is what we see back here. So he had a miniature alternating current system on display so people could see how the electricity was being produced and how it was being transmitted through wires and then transformed down to a level that could be used for appliances, for streetcars, and things like that. And if you look way in the back, there's this mural of Columbus that is entirely light bulbs. And so he's showing how electricity can be used for advertising and how it can be used for artwork as well. So I mentioned that Pittsburghers were excited about a Chicago fair because it meant that a lot of the visitors would be passing through town. But that also meant that in the weeks leading up to the opening of the fair, a lot of the exhibits going to Chicago would also be passing through Pittsburgh. And so a few notable ones made stops in town. And so there's a night where the Liberty Bell actually spends the evening down at the point on the railroad tracks. And lots of folks from Pittsburgh come down and they take a look. And there's a big fireworks display, even though it's raining, because Pittsburgh loves its fireworks. And they had a huge celebration. Now, as the Bell is downtown, the Krupp Gun Company from Essen, Germany, is shipping over the largest cannon in the world, and to put it on display at the Columbian Exposition. And it arrives in Baltimore, and once the folks in the shipyard figure out a way to get it out of the ship, they load it onto specialty railroad cars that were designed by the Pennsylvania Railroad in Altoona, and it starts to slowly make its way across the country. And so this enormous cannon behind me here spends the evening in the rail yards in Pittsburgh Strip District, and people are allowed to come in and see it. Eventually, people get really excited and they decide they're going to start climbing on it. And then folks find some chalk and they decide they're going to start writing their names on it because we can't behave ourselves. But what this does is, all these exhibits passing through town, it gets people excited about the fair. So the entire month of April, everybody in Pittsburgh is sort of working themselves into a frenzy about what else might they see when they go to Chicago. And for Pittsburghers who can't afford that trip to the World's Fair, they can at least feel like they're a part of it. They can go and they can visit these exhibits as they're passing through. And then certainly they can read about it in the extensive coverage in the newspapers throughout the summer and fall. So how do exhibits get from Pennsylvania, and specifically Pittsburgh, to Chicago for the fair? The state of Pennsylvania had a board of World Fair managers who were basically made up of prominent citizens throughout the state. And they were kind of soliciting maybe one or two items from various people that could be part of the Pennsylvania exhibit and all the buildings in the Court of Honor. Locally in Pittsburgh, the Chamber of Commerce also had a World's Fair committee, and they were contacting anybody and everybody that had something to put on display to try to get as much from Western Pennsylvania to the fair as possible. In May of 1892, they hold a really large banquet at the Duquesne Club downtown, and Mayor Gurley kind of lays out his vision for the importance of the fair to the city of Pittsburgh. And basically, and I'm paraphrasing here, he says that Chicago, the only reason that they are hosting the fair is because people from Chicago won't stop talking about how great the city is, and people from Pittsburgh just don't do that. And so at the Columbian Exposition, that is where Pittsburgh is going to start talking about all the wonderful things that happen in that city and how significant it is, not just to the country, but to the world. And he sort of makes this challenge in a room full of the richest, wealthiest, best connected people in town. And several people there are in position to really sort of make this a reality. One of those people was Henry Clay Frick. So Frick was put in charge of developing the exhibit for the Carnegie Steel Company. Being the art lover that he is, he hired an interior designer to come up with the plan for the Carnegie Steel exhibit. And once he saw the plans and approved them, he sent them on to Carnegie for his approval before they would install it at the fair. When Carnegie got the plans, he hated it. He thought it looked pretentious. He called it too Frenchy, but never really expressed what that is, so I don't know what he meant by that. But he essentially said that he would rather not exhibit at all than use the display that Frick had commissioned. And so Carnegie Steel Company does not exhibit at the Columbian Exposition. Now, this is the second time that we see Carnegie sort of step in, claiming that he's retired, but stepping into these business decisions that have been made by Henry Clay Frick and his colleagues. And I think this one sort of hit Frick a little bit harder for a few reasons. One, like I said, Frick was an art guy, and so the fact that Carnegie hated this design sort of picked at his abilities as an art critic, and I think that Frick really took that personally. They also were having this conversation in November of 1892, and this is right at the conclusion of the 1892 Homestead Steel Strike. This is a strike that saw Frick get blasted in the newspapers for hiring the Pinkerton Detective Agency to come in and break the strike. These same newspapers reached out to Carnegie, and Carnegie claimed he had no idea what Frick was doing while he was out in Scotland. This is also a strike that saw Frick shot and stabbed as a result of all of this notoriety. And so, again, Frick really took these decisions personally. But to save face, he wrote to his colleagues in Carnegie Steel and said, well, you know what, I never thought that this was going to be a good idea anyway, hosting, having an exhibit at the fair, but I had to wait for Carnegie to give the okay before we ended it. We know this isn't true, though, because he spends thousands of dollars on the exhibit for the Frick Coke Company, which he did have controlling interest of and made all the decisions for. And so what we see then is a very large exhibit for the Frick Coke Company, which is down here with the bluish tint. Essentially, this is a model of a coal patch town near Connellsville, Pennsylvania. It had a working model railroad. It had miniatures of mines and coal tipples, worker housing, and lots of little beehive coke ovens with gas jets inside, so they were actually like fire inside. They looked like they were operational. Folks who saw the exhibit loved it. He won an award at the fair for this exhibit. And it was loved so much that in 1894, it was reinstalled at the Western Pennsylvania Exposition in downtown Pittsburgh, and that's actually where this photograph was taken. Another Pittsburgh exhibitor at the Columbian Exposition was H.J. Heinz, and that's the other photo we have here. So the Heinz exhibit consisted of a pyramid of glass jars containing Heinz products at the center. And then on the four corners, there was a pagoda, each one staffed by a woman that spoke 4 languages so that the majority of visitors could be greeted in their own tongue. Now, when H.J. Heinz visited his exhibit at the beginning of the fair, though, there was a problem. It looked a lot like it does in this picture. There's like nobody there. And that reason is because it's on the 2nd floor of the agricultural building. And the last thing that fairgoers want to do after spending all day walking around the fair looking at exhibits is to climb a bunch of stairs to look at more stuff. And so he had an idea to print off coupons that basically said, if you redeem this at the Heinz booth, you will get a free souvenir. And he hired boys to distribute these all over the fairgrounds. So now suddenly thousands of people every day are climbing those steps to the Heinz booth so they could redeem their ticket for a free souvenir, which was a tiny little pickle charm that becomes the pickle pin that we know and love today. The Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh actually has one from the World's Fair on display that you can see. But people were also going to the Heinz booth because they're giving out free samples, right? The fair is an expensive place, but if you can climb those stairs and get to the Heinz booth, you suddenly have a free lunch, which is another nice benefit of making the trip. This became so popular, he gave away over 1 million pickle charms during the course of the fair. So many people would come at a time that the exposition actually had to post guards to control the crowds. And at the end of the fair, when they tore down the display, they found that the floor beneath it was actually sagging from the weight of all the people that were coming to the exhibit. All the other American vendors on that floor were also very thankful for Heinz because that meant that more people were coming to their booth as well. And so when the fair ended, they held a big banquet in his honor and actually gave him a trophy of thanks for doing that. Lots of other local companies participated in the fair. A newer company called the Pittsburgh Reduction Company, which later becomes Alcoa, is one of the only aluminum producing companies that have an exhibit at the fair. And then there's also lots of local craftsmen, like leather workers from Allegheny City especially, and farmers that have some of their produce on display as well. But the exposition wasn't just about industrial exhibits. Lots of other Western Pennsylvania exhibits were on display. So John Brashear had a display of some of his glass lenses that he produced and telescopes that use those lenses. A lot of local public and parochial schools had student work on display, so they actually display some of their students' work. And the Western University of Pennsylvania was one of a handful of higher ed institutions from Pennsylvania that also had a booth. Western University had a display of photographs of some of its more prominent alumni and faculty, and examples of their student and faculty research as well. But probably the most significant part about the Western University exhibit was its location, because it was right around the corner from the University of Pennsylvania. And they realized that lots of visitors started to mistake Western University as being sort of like a branch campus or some kind of affiliate of Penn. And so just over 10 years later, when Western University is debating of changing its name to the University of Pittsburgh, They cite the World's Fair as one of the reasons why they should change their name, so they could avoid some of that confusion. So we've talked a bit about exhibits that are on display in the Court of Honor, the White City. We mentioned the Ferris wheel, and which was in the Midway Plaisance. But there was a third arm of the Columbian Exposition that doesn't get talked about a lot, and that was called the World's Congress Auxiliary. And basically, this is a planning body that organizes conferences that were held throughout the entire duration of the fair, touching on various scientific and social topics. And we see lots of folks from Western Pennsylvania participate in these conferences as speakers or just as attendees. So for an example, a local journalist, Kara Reese, gives a talk at the Women's Conference about the importance of housewives and working women sort of supporting each other so that they can improve the conditions of all women, not kind of like fighting amongst themselves about whose interests were more important. There were several Pittsburgh clergymen that were involved in the Conference on Temperance. One of them gave a talk about the importance of closing saloons on Sundays. He pointed out that a lot of his parishioners were steel workers, and they relied on the amount of steel that they produced for their wages. And so if somebody on their crew came to work on Monday either drunk or hungover from drinking on saloons all day on Sunday, it was actually going to be costing them money because they wouldn't be producing as much steel as they should. So he wasn't talking about moral arguments or health arguments for why drinking was bad. It was literally talking about the pocketbook of the workers themselves. And then Pauline Rosenberg, who was a woman from Allegheny City, which is Pittsburgh's north side, gave a talk at the Conference on Jewish Women about the significance of Columbus's discovering the New World and being sort of a second chance for the Jewish people to sort of like reinvent themselves and be accepted. Later in that conference, she went on to help found the National Council for Jewish Women, which is still active today. The Pittsburgh Chamber of Commerce was also at the fair, distributing pamphlets called Guide to All Points of Interest in and About Pittsburgh. We might expect this pamphlet to talk about, steel companies and industry and things like that. But as you read the pamphlet, what it's actually talking about is going on river excursions. It's about taking the incline to the top of Mount Washington and looking at the view. It's all about tourism. It's all that stuff that, like, if you were visiting Pittsburgh today, you would go and do with, like, family who've never been there before, that kind of thing. So in 1893, they're really trying to push Pittsburgh as being a viable tourist attraction. There were several Pittsburgh artists that had works on display at the fair. So folks like George Hetzel, Thomas Shields Clark, Joseph Woodwell. The most famous, though, was Mary Cassatt. Mary Cassatt was born in Allegheny City and then moved to Philadelphia, where she trained as a painter, before she moved to Paris and became an influential member of the Impressionist movement. And Paris is where Bertha Palmer, the chair of the Women's Committee, found her and asked her if she would paint a mural for the inside of the Women's Building, and the mural would be called Modern Woman, and that's pretty much all the information she gave her about it. Mary Cassatt had never painted a mural before. Impressionists really didn't do public artwork very much, but despite the lack of her experience in this medium, despite the objections from her friends in the Impressionist movement, Cassatt agreed to paint the mural. She also insisted that she be paid the same amount of money as her male counterparts, so good for her. This is the mural that results from this commission. So you'll see she broke it into 3 parts. From left to right, it shows women pursuing fame, women sort of plucking the fruits of knowledge, and then women pursuing the arts. And you'll notice that there's a really large border around the mural itself, and then in separating the triptych. This meant that a lot of the figures on the mural itself were actually smaller than life size, which made it very hard to read from like 2 stories down on the floor. The folks that did bother to look up and really sort of take in the mural, a lot of them didn't really like it very much. For one thing, she used the bright colors of the Impressionist movement, which sort of clashed against the pastels and the whites that were all over the White City. A lot of the art critics thought that she took advantage of the commission and painted what she thought modern women should be and not what modern women actually were. And some went so far as to say that she actually failed as a muralist because she was not feminine enough. She didn't meet the criteria that the Victorian woman should meet. Cassatt was so hurt by these criticisms that she never traveled to Chicago to see the mural on display sort of in the building. And shortly after the fair closed, the mural went missing. And so we actually still today don't know where this mural is or whether it still exists. That's the really bad photograph of it. So during 1893, though, getting to Chicago to visit the fair became a top priority for lots of people around the country. And folks in Pittsburgh were no exception. One good example of this was the chancellor of Western University, William Holland. His son was playing with a firecracker and it exploded and burned the side of his face. And when the chancellor wrote to the boy's grandfather to explain what happened, he said, "It's okay, he'll be fine. We got to get on the train tonight because we're going to the Columbian Exposition." So clearly, it was a little bit higher priority than his son Moorhead's health. Getting to the fair, though, also became sort of a status symbol, particularly for folks who are sort of just entering the middle class, because as industry in Pittsburgh is really starting to balloon, we see the middle class also really start to expand. And so the fair provides a really good example for those newcomers to the middle class to kind of demonstrate that they have that discretionary income that they could spend on a vacation to Chicago. They could afford a few days at the fair. Maybe they can buy souvenirs that they can put on display in their home. And sort of, it's a way to show that they belong. If they're really savvy, they would go to the Pennsylvania building while they were at the fair because there was a ledger where they could sign their name and their hometown. And then a local reporter would come by every night and actually transcribe those names, and they would print them in the local newspaper. So eventually you could come home and look in the newspaper and say, "Look, see, my name is here. I made it. I was there." So we see a lot of middle-class family names listed in the newspapers as attending the fair throughout the entire duration. Thanks to these lists, we know that at least 10,000 families from Western Pennsylvania made the trip. And again, that's primarily middle-class families, folks like Henry Clay Frick, who visited several times. He didn't bother to sign his name on that register. And 10,000 is probably a very conservative estimate on the number of folks that were there from Pittsburgh. I was really interested, though, in what was that personal experience? What was it like to be somebody from Pittsburgh to go to Chicago and actually attend the fair? I'm very lucky because the archives that I work at the University of Pittsburgh has a small group of letters written by a young woman named Margaret Mitchell, who went to the fair with her husband and then wrote letters back to her parents and her toddler daughter about what she was doing and what she was experiencing. And so we know what hotels she stayed at, we know what trolley she took, we know what gate she used to get into the fair. But we also get her impressions of the fair. She called the Columbian Exposition a peep into paradise. She tells us about the conditions of the fair when she went in early June. It's still not finished. They're still working on it. She also shows that she has at least some familiarity with the exhibits that are there from Pittsburgh. She notes that the Ferris wheel is the tallest thing there and that it was made by a Pittsburgher. Mitchell also makes an observation that going to the Columbian Exposition was just as good as traveling around the world because you would meet people from all over, not just the United States, most likely for the first time, but also people from all these different countries, particularly in the Midway Plaisance that had lots of international exhibits. And so if you couldn't afford a trip around the world, you could at least come to Chicago and experience all these cultures. Now, we might dismiss this observation as just being like, these are the musings of somebody who really didn't travel very much. But Andrew Carnegie and H.J. Heinz, who had traveled the world, made the exact same argument. And so we do see that there is some truth to the fact that you could experience lots of different cultures by going to Chicago during the fair. Now, when the fair opened at the beginning of May, shortly thereafter, there was a financial panic, the Panic of 1893. And so suddenly, the fair organizers were concerned that people would not want to spend their hard-earned money traveling to Chicago just to look at a bunch of stuff to go to a fair. And so he hired the artist Frank Millet to be his director of celebrations. And Millet came up with an idea on how to get people to come to Chicago. by essentially naming certain days as like specialty days. So Chicago Day becomes the most well-attended day at the fair because folks from Chicago felt like they needed to come that day. Lots of different states had their own designated day at the exposition, including Pennsylvania. The problem with Pennsylvania Day, though, was that all of the planners and everybody on the program for Pennsylvania Day was from Eastern Pennsylvania. There were no Pittsburghers involved in Pennsylvania Day. And when Pittsburgh's mayor heard that, he was not happy. And so he called together a special meeting of the city councils and the mayors from Pittsburgh and Allegheny City. And they decided that if they weren't going to be included in Pennsylvania Day, they would have their own Western Pennsylvania Day instead. The newspaper called this Twin City Day, the Twin Cities being Allegheny and Pittsburgh. I've never seen them refer to that as Twin Cities other than this one event. But they get permission from the Columbian Exposition, from the governor, to host Twin City Day a few days after Pennsylvania Day. They get all the entertainment together. The only thing that's left to do is get as many Pittsburghers as possible to Chicago to attend the celebration. So they reached out to the various railroad companies and to see if they would give them sort of special discounted rates for travel, and the railroad said no. We're not gonna drop down to the ticket price that you want. An ugly public relations battle in the newspaper ensues. Basically, the city councils felt that they were owed these discounted tickets because for years, for decades, they've provided concessions and rights of way to the railroad companies to let their trains pass in and out of the cities relatively unencumbered. And finally, Pittsburgh's mayor says, if you can't meet our price for the tickets, then people can't go. There's no point in doing this at all. And so Twin City Day is canceled and it never actually happens. Now I know, I keep talking about stuff that didn't happen. I apologize. But I think we can learn stuff. I think we can learn things from these. So in the case of the tower, in the case of Carnegie Steel exhibit, we really get to an in-depth look on what that relationship between Frick and Andrew Carnegie really looked like, and how much Carnegie overstepped in the control of his business. In the case of Twin City Day, I think we learned a few things. We learned that the rivalry with Philadelphia is not just for sports. We see that Pittsburgh and Allegheny would come together for a common cause even before Pittsburgh annexes Allegheny City in 1907. And we also kind of get a peek behind the curtain on what that relationship was like between city government and the railroad companies and how much sway the railroad companies really had in what was going on in the cities. Now, even with Twin City Day not happening, like I said, over 10,000 Pittsburgh families make their way to Chicago and experience the fair. And when they get to Chicago, they look around and they realize, this feels pretty familiar. This is a dirty, smoky city, just like Pittsburgh. But then they get to the Columbian Exposition, and it's clean and it's bright, and they're like, how can we do this? This is what we want in Pittsburgh. Where can we do this? And so they look to the Oakland neighborhood in Pittsburgh as being the perfect place to sort of build their own version of the White City. The timing is absolutely perfect because in 1889, Mary Shenley, who owned the majority of that neighborhood, donated 300 acres for Shenley Park. Shenley had inherited a lot of this land when she was a toddler back in the 1820s and moved to London in the 1840s. And so she never really bothered to develop this area of land. But she didn't really do much with it, renting or otherwise. And so now that she donated 300 acres, the wheels started turning for developers that, maybe she'll sell more, and this can be a place where we can start to build out. Not so much while she's alive, but after she dies in 1903, we start to see developers start to purchase large tracts of land in Oakland exactly for this purpose. So there are, I think, three key people that are really involved that I want to talk about. The first is the Director of Public Works, Edward Manning Bigelow. So he was involved in kind of helping Shenley decide that she wanted to donate the park. And then once the park was secured, he hired a sculptor named Giuseppe Moretti to come over from Italy and add some artwork into Shenley Park. And this really sort of gets at things that they've seen at the Columbian Exposition, where sculptures were at the ends of bridges and throughout, and becomes something called the City Beautiful movement. And so Moretti does the panther sculptures on the corners of the Panther Hollow Bridge, and then a few years later, he actually does a statue of Bigelow himself right inside Shenley Park. In terms of, as the fair is ending, Bigelow goes to Chicago to the horticultural building, and he actually secures a lot of the plants that were on display from Western Pennsylvania and has them brought to Phipps Conservatory, which was just opening up. And so folks, again, from Pittsburgh can go to something in town and actually experience things that were on display in Chicago. In terms of architecture, there's two architects that are really responsible for sort of shaping Oakland in the image of the White City. The first is Henry Hornbostel. Hornbostel visited the Columbian Exposition and then basically immediately went to France and studied architecture at the École des Beaux-Arts. So when he comes back to Pittsburgh then, he gets several commissions where he sort of incorporates all these ideas that he saw in Chicago and in France into Oakland. And so he's responsible for the campus of the new Carnegie Technical Schools, which is going to be on your top left. The Soldiers and Sailors Memorial, which is sort of that large building in the center with the flag on top. And then he also gets the commission for the new University of Pittsburgh campus, which is sort of in the foreground here. That plan is called the Acropolis Plan because it was a few dozen buildings on a hillside that kind of resembled the ancient Greek Acropolis in Athens. Ultimately, they only built 4 buildings from that plan because it wasn't shaping up to be quite like he had drawn it out, but still, there were some buildings there. The other architect that really has a hand in this is named Benno Janssen. Janssen adds a building to Hornbostel's plan for Pitt. It's now called Eberly Hall. It was called Alumni Hall. He builds the Pittsburgh Athletic Association, which is sort of next to the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial. He does the Masonic Temple, which is now Pitt's Alumni Hall. He does the Mellon Institute, which has these enormous solid stone columns. He also does the Young Men's and Women's Hebrew Association. And so he kind of fills in all of these blank spaces in Oakland. But what we have in Oakland then is a small group of architects that are building in the same style, pretty much the same palette. This is the exact scenario that we had in the White City for the Columbian Exposition. And what we get ultimately is the same result, which is a collection of buildings that's greater than the sum of its parts. Now, one building I didn't mention there in Oakland is the Carnegie Institute. That's because it was designed and it was being built at the same time as the Columbian Exposition. So this is what it looked like when it was first built. You'll see there's a little bit of sort of Renaissance style to it, but otherwise not so much of that neoclassical style that we know from Chicago. To look at the fair's influence when it opens, you kind of have to step inside, because inside the building, in addition to the library, we see there are industrial and natural history exhibits, music and lecture halls, there's an art gallery. Essentially, you could go to the Carnegie Institute and do in a few hours what people would spend days doing at the Columbian Exposition. So it's really sort of like a mini World's Fair right inside the Institute. In 1907, there's an enormous addition put on this building. They take those 2 towers off, they put on a new neoclassical entrance to the music hall, they add a hall of sculpture and a hall of architecture. These all have those ancient influences that we saw in the White City, and so the building looks a lot more, kind of blends in more today in Oakland than it did when it was initially built in the 1890s. Now, in addition to the Court of Honor sort of influencing Pittsburgh's development, the Midway Plaisance and the Ferris wheel also had an influence. The Ferris wheel showed that people would pay good money just to be entertained and through rides. And so the Western Pennsylvania Exposition downtown and lots of the local trolley parks, including Kennywood, slowly started to incorporate rides into their parks as a way to draw people in. But the most sort of complete adoption of the World's Fair Midway Plaisance model was Luna Park. Luna Park only existed for not even 5 years in North Oakland off of Craig and Baum Boulevard at that intersection. But we see it has a huge neoclassical entrance. It's got rides, including this water ride that sort of mimics the lagoon that we saw in that very first slide at the Court of Honor. You can encounter lots of new technologies there, like Edison's kinetoscope. There's a Japanese pavilion, so you can even experience new cultures. And all of this is decked out in light bulbs, more electricity, right? But for the few years that Luna Park is open, it really serves as the midway to the rest of Oakland's Court of Honor. Now, the Chicago Fair was always meant to be temporary. It's essentially steel structures with plaster walls. There's only one building that remains today. The Fine Arts Building is now the Museum of Science and Industry. Don't worry, they changed the plaster to stone, so it's not going anywhere. But if you visit Oakland today, you can see lots of buildings that are inspired by the Columbian Exposition. There's also several organizations that kind of look back to the World's Fair as being their origin, things like the 20th Century Club and the National Council for Jewish Women. The Carnegie International Art Exhibit is also meant to sort of mimic the fine arts displays that were at World's Fairs. But really, by the beginning of World War I, Pittsburgh had incorporated many of the lessons that it learned in Chicago to help promote the image of Pittsburgh that it wanted to show off at the Columbian Exposition in the first place, mainly that it was a center of culture and innovation. So I want to thank you all again for coming. I apologize, I do not have any books with me, but if you do the QR code thing, that will take you to the Pitt Press website where the book is. It's on Amazon and everything else. But thank you again for coming, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
You know the drill. If you have a question, raise your hand, I'll come to you. It would have to be across the room. Got one first, and then you. I'll go. Gotta get my exercise, my steps in. Hold on. There you go.
Yeah, I'm curious to know about that Mary Cassatt. You refer to it as a mural. Was it a fresco, or do you know?
I mean, ultimately, it was just a very large painting, is what it was. She actually, at her home in France, she dug a trench, and then would raise and lower the canvas so that she wouldn't have to leave the ground to be able to paint it. So she came up with this whole crazy system of pulleys to do that. But I think ultimately it was just a painting, and then when it was uninstalled, they just kind of like rolled it up. It was given to Bertha Palmer, who was the chair of the Women's Committee. She's tucked it in storage, and then they lost track of it and never found.
So it could still exist rather easily. If
Fingers crossed it's still somewhere, yeah.
Joe?
Are Heinz and Westinghouse still in business? I know my Heinz stock was bought by Warren Buffett. So, are they still manufacturing or doing anything?
Certainly in name they are. Whether or not, I don't know, like the chain of custody of that name. I'm sure they're owned by a much larger corporation, probably both of them. But George Westinghouse himself lost control of his company somewhere in the 19-teens, I believe. He was sort of well known for being very kind to his workers, and as soon as he lost control of the company, we start to see labor unrest in Pittsburgh at his companies, and so we see some influence of his going away and how that impacted the company. But to my knowledge, both companies exist. Whether or not it's still sort of like their own company or part of something bigger, I'm not sure.
Was there a question over there? Mom, did you have a question?
No.
You didn't. Okay. Yes, sir.
My question doesn't deal with Pittsburgh, so maybe I shouldn't ask it. But my great-grandfather was an architect, and he joined the firm of McKim, Mead and White. Mm-hmm. And he joined it back in 1884. The question is, might he have been involved in the design of any of their buildings?
It's very well possible. McKim, I don't think all three of them were involved, but at least two of them, I believe, were. I can't recall which specific buildings that they designed for the fair, but it's very well possible. If nothing else, he maybe drafted plans for it. McKim, Weed and White also did the electrical plant that Westinghouse built at Niagara Falls. So there were definitely commissions and things that spin out of the World's Fair that he may have played a hand in.
Okay, one more here, and that's going to bring us to the close.
Just a statement, I guess. The founder here of Wheeling Machine grew up in northern Michigan, and he came down to visit the Columbian Exposition and got turned on by the technology, I guess. You know, he founded the company over here in Wheeling.
Yeah.
And the first building he came into, he had to clear out some sort of experimental aluminum smelter. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff was going on at that period. That's it.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Zach.
Thank you.